90.7 KSQD, K-Squid, your ink spot on the dial. And this is State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. And I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, licensed marriage and family therapist. Today we're going to be talking about the topic of surviving and recovering from grief following a suicide. I am fortunate enough today to be joined by two very knowledgeable and thoughtful guests. With me today is Rabbi Lori, who is the Director of Spiritual Care Service at Stanford Healthcare. She's a board-certified chaplain who's worked as an interfaith oncology chaplain at Stanford Healthcare from 2007 to 2014. She's also a spiritual leader in Santa Cruz, and she was ordained in January 2006 through the Aleph Rabbinical Program. She's taught on religion and spirituality in the U.S. and Central Europe and leads and creates rituals for every stage of the life cycle. Prior to her ordination, she worked as an attorney for 20 years, specializing in criminal and child dependency appeals. Also with me today is Kara Bowman. She's a licensed as of, when was that?
4 days ago.
4 days ago, a licensed marriage and family therapist who has worked as a grief counselor at Hospice of Santa Cruz County for 4 years. She's certified in Thantology, the study of death and dying, by the Association for Death Education and Counseling, and is also a certified grief counselor through the American Academy of Grief Counseling. She's worked with many clients who have lost a loved one to suicide and has also been touched by suicide in her own personal life. So welcome. Thank you for being here with me today.
Thank you, Deborah.
Yeah. Let's just, to start, I'd like to just start with you, Kara, if that's okay.
Sure.
I know that this can be a topic that's difficult for a lot of people. I want to let our listeners know that when we finish, you'll also provide some resources and different website and things that they could access if they want help and support. But I thought maybe we would start with, why do you think it's important to talk about adult suicide and the grief that follows?
I think it's important because so many people are suffering and we can help. You just gave the answer in your question, which is it's a difficult thing to talk about for most of us. There are 750,000 Americans who are touched by the death of someone they know from suicide every year. And that adds up to about half of all Americans who know someone who's died from suicide. Because death in general is not a subject that our culture does well, so many of us want to help and don't know how. So I think that's why it's important to talk about it.
In general, would you say, how does grief following a suicide significantly different, say, from other types of grief?
That's a big question. So all death and all loss has a huge variety of emotions attached to it. And I could name some, but I would be afraid that someone might not hear something they're feeling on the list and then think it wasn't a valid emotion. Any emotion is valid after a death. In suicide, the research shows that the grief process tends to be more intense and more prolonged. It also shows that there are 4 emotions that are more prominent in death after suicide than in other deaths, and those are shame, guilt, blame, and anger. And if you look at that list, they all have an element of thought involved. There's a thought that goes with shame, blame, guilt, and often with anger there's a should thought, not always. Mm-hmm. So the main difference is these angers come up because thoughts are different after a suicide. There can be so many questions of why. Our brains are wired to try to understand, to try to prevent in the future, to try to learn. So our brains are wired to go back and back over the questions of why until we understand. And one of the problems with suicide is often there never will be that understanding. Mm-hmm.
So what I'm hearing from you, Kara, is that just the sort of getting through navigating the grief following a suicide is a lot more complex and often painful for people.
And I would agree with that, but I would say it can be.
It can be. Thank you.
Yeah, mm-hmm. It can be. Some people Every death is just a mixture of factors, and for some people, other deaths are more difficult for them.
Well, we're going to come back to you in a little bit, but we're also with us today is Rabbi Lori Klein, and we are so fortunate that Lori has offered to share her own story of losing her mother to suicide when she was in her early 20s, and her mother was just in her 40s, and also to talk about her many years, I would say, of navigating a process of healing and recovery and acceptance. So I really appreciate you coming in today, Lori, and sharing, such a personal story with our listeners. I think it's really meaningful for people.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like it's important to be here.
So would you be willing to tell us a little bit about what was going on when your mother died and how that impacted you at that time?
Sure. So far as I know, my mother first started having symptoms of having bipolar disorder when she was a teenager. And I first started noticing that she had these confusing and scary moods when I was about 7, and she probably would have been in her early 30s then. And over time, her depression and her mania became more frequent, more intense, more prolonged. And they got a lot worse around the time I left for college. And when she had a major break about when she was 20, when I was 20, she went into the hospital at the university I was at. And a couple years after that, I was getting ready to start law school. I literally was home for Labor Day weekend. And in those couple months before that, my mother had lost her ability to concentrate well enough to read. She was an elementary school teacher. She didn't really feel she could work. And she had started becoming delusional that summer and emotionally isolated herself from us and also from some of her closest friends. And I think she just lost hope. And so that Labor Day weekend, she ended her life, and she took a lot of Tylenol. And she died about a day later. And so to answer your question, how did it impact me? I was really devastated by it. I wasn't surprised because of how difficult the previous couple of years had been, and she had been talking on and off about wanting to end her life. We were extremely close. I mean, our relationship could be very fraught because when my mother was manic, she could also be really emotionally cruel. But she had normal periods where she was a great mother, and even though I was a teenager, we were very close. So when she died, I felt like I lost, not only did I lose a parent, but I lost somebody who I considered a friend and also an alter ego in some ways.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm really glad you talk about that someone is not all their illness, right? That there's these periods of absence where you are filled with hope again, right?
That's right. Yeah. There were. I think in some ways it was wonderful that, of course, that there were all these times when she was normal, and then she was funny and smart and creative and somebody who not only I but my friends wanted to talk to. And one of the things that was confusing for me, especially in my teen years, was I never knew which mother I was going to get, almost moment to moment. And she could shift into despair or mania or be normal again, over the course of an hour.
Yeah. Well, that's a really hard thing to live with, that uncertainty all the time. Yeah. So when we were talking in preparation for the show, I remember you said you considered yourself a survivor. That stood out to me, and I'm wondering if you talk about why you describe yourself that way, and why is it meaningful to you to do that?
I started calling myself a survivor because I didn't have a word for me, and then when I started hearing that in the culture, that some people call immediate family members of a loved one who ends their life, call them a survivor, I thought, okay, that's a word for me. The reason why it's meaningful is, when I think about it, if somebody lives through a tsunami in their area, they're called a survivor. And this was my tsunami. And I also, survivors have a really complicated range of emotions also, and I've definitely had that complicated range of emotions myself. And if I think about some of the positive emotions I felt as a survivor, I'm grateful that I came through my growing up years and my mother's death relatively whole. I mean, it hasn't been easy. I've done a lot of work, but I'm 58 and I feel relatively whole. And I also, survivors often have things they can pass on, ways that they can become teachers, or ways that they draw on their experience that informs their life and how they are in the world. And I have that as well. So in all those ways, I feel like I share the characteristics of a survivor.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to say more about how, when you said you draw on those experiences in order to sort of make a contribution in the world, how would you say that that's come about for you?
I understand in my bones how complicated and long-lasting grief can be, and how much it can shift over time. I sometimes think about my recovery process as having this spiral effect, in that it has felt over the years, because it's been almost 36 years since my mother died, or about 36 years, that I come back to the same issues, but I'm different, and so it's not exactly the same. And so there's that. And also, right at the time my mother died, I was a very young adult, and there were a number of my friends who were either frightened or just couldn't tolerate somebody going through so much emotional suffering. And some of them didn't deal so well with it and almost abandoned me as friends. And some of them really came through. And I couldn't predict in advance who would fall into which group. And so I spent several years of my life as a chaplain, as an oncology chaplain. And I find that many people living with cancer have that same kind of experience. Some of their friends show up and some of them really can't. And that in itself can be very painful. And so I feel like I have ways of relating to people with that experience, and also I have all these ways that I can empathize with people who benefit from friends who can listen to them, and suffer when friends can't. And then finally, I feel like it's helped me to be a better listener and to understand how important it is sometimes to tolerate another person's emotional suffering, and that when somebody is emotionally suffering, what they most need is for somebody to be there with them and not to try to change the subject, and to allow the person who's suffering to express themselves.
Mm. Yeah, they don't really have to fix it or anything, just be there with them.
That's right.
Yeah. You know, when you were talking, you said that the grief really changes over time, but you revisit sort of similar aspects of it. I was wondering, would you be willing to give us kind of an overview of like what that's looked like for you? Because you said it's been 30 years, right?
Yeah, more,
and that it's changed a lot over that time. So I know there's 30 years would be too much to review in its entirety, but sort of like, if you could just do a slice in time at different ages or stages of your life.
Yeah, the first few months and I won't go months by months, but that was its own section. The first few months, my grief was visceral and pretty all-consuming. And even then, I would have these flashes of noticing a beautiful sunset or noticing, like my core life energy coming up. And so even in that all-consuming time, there were these rays of hope. And one of the things that was happening during those first few months was I had no positive memories of my mother. I really only could think of the suffering of those last few years of her life. And then a couple months later, the positive memories started coming back. So that was a big change. And so here I had decided to start law school. And I gave myself permission for most of that first semester to walk out of class if I felt like crying, not study, go home to be with my father and brother. And when I was coming to the end of that first semester, I realized that if I didn't put my grief away for a little while, I was going to flunk out, and I didn't want to. And so I kind of suppressed the really expressive parts of my grief. And that suppression actually lasted for about 8 years. And it was during that time when I wasn't continuing to really work it through. Those 8 years were the only time when sometimes I was so depressed I just stayed on the couch all day. And when I was 30, my female partner left me, and almost immediately all that suppressed grief about my mom came up. And that was when I went into therapy. When I started becoming more spiritual again, I started doing various ceremonies and rituals to help address it. I was running and doing Tai Chi, and so I just went through this healing trajectory of doing different things over time. When I became a rabbinical student, I started doing spiritual direction. So that period lasted until I was in my mid-40s, and just really a lot of work in healing and peeling off layer after layer. And shortly before I was ordained, so I was 45, I met with my spiritual director and was asking, what did I need to do? What spiritual or emotional work did I need to do to really be ready to be ordained? And she led me through a guided visualization where what I did was my spirit left my body, most of my spirit left my body and went back out through the door I came in when I was born into this life. I went back out through that door and took off what she called the trauma jacket that I had worn that had all the accumulated trauma of my mother's illness, living with my mother's illness and her death, and put on a clean jacket. And then I came back down into my body. And since then, I don't have intrusive thoughts when I'm coming up on an anniversary of her death anymore. The level of my grieving and the level of my, the ways in which I react to that trauma has been reduced tremendously. So these past 13 years have been much more peaceful for me. And I still startle easily. I still sometimes really have to talk to myself to stay present. If a friend or just somebody I'm talking with talks about wanting to end their life. So I still always feel like I will be healing for the rest of my life, and my own suffering around it is greatly reduced in these more recent years. And I feel, there have been different points along the way where I've had feelings of either loss of relationship or regained relationship with my mother. And now, in these more peaceful last 13 years, I feel that sometimes I do feel my mother's voice in me, and there's ways that I learn from her, and it also feels more distant and detached than it did earlier in my life.
What a moving description. Really, really touching. And how powerful it sounds like, that experience. I mean, just all of the combined experiences, it sounds like they got you ready for that deeper, more spiritual healing kind of experience that you had.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
A metaphor I use sometimes is recovering from grief after something so large. It's like peeling a very large onion. So there's always more layers, but you are getting somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in terms of that idea of sort of being a survivor and recovering from it, what do you think are sort of key aspects of that?
Well, for me, and I think we all have our own list, so for me, having some friends who could really hang in there with me and be with me in whatever way I needed. I had a really gifted psychotherapist who I worked with for about 3 years. When I became a rabbinical student and my rabbinic mentor said, you need to heal more before you can hold the spirits and hearts of people who you are caring for, and so working with gifted spiritual directors. But also, I mean, this has been true for me since childhood, but also as an adult, I have read and reread the Anne of Green Gables series because I feel that Anne is a master of resilience. I've learned so much from that, and I've made up various rituals and ceremonies to, get through some of the more difficult things. So what I did was I was working with a particular kind of therapist about one of the consequences of living with a mother with bipolar disorder is I got very, very nervous around potential conflict with people like friends and lovers. And so what she did is she helped me go back really deeply into a memory of a certain kind of conflict I had with my mother. And I went deeply back into that memory, and then I fashioned a new ending to that memory. Mm-hmm. And that, again, it wasn't a 100% fix, but it really, I used to be, when I was anticipating conflict with a loved one, I might think of 100 different ways it could go. And now maybe I think about 3, and it takes a lot less time and energy. Mm-hmm. And I just want to say just one more thing about recovery, just that I've been with my partner Irene now for more than 20 years, and I know that everybody doesn't have a partner, but having a partner or a friend who really helps you to be emotionally vulnerable has been very healing.
Kara, as you listen to Lori share her story of healing, I'm wondering if there are things that stand out to you just in working with so many different people who experience grief that really resonate or remind you of sort of stories that you've heard from other people.
There are. First, I want to say thank you so much for offering your story to others, to help others. I imagine that's a courageous thing to do, and
I've been more nervous than I expected. Preparing.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it, and also appreciate the amount of pain that's in your story for you, for your mother, for your family. There's a lot there. And I look at every grief as a painting. Each person has a palette they paint with. That's who they are and what they come with. And their grief is very, very individual. So there are pieces of what you went through that are typical, I would say, and then there are pieces that aren't, and every grief will be its own flower. One thing I heard you say was you lost a parent, a friend, and an alter ego. So with every person we mourn, there are multiple losses, and they're specific to that situation. With suicide, we're mourning the manner of death. We're often mourning that the death came too soon, as with your mother. The person didn't get to live their full lifespan. We're mourning whatever role they filled in our life as a parent, a child, a spouse, a friend. We're mourning the specifics about that relationship. Sometimes we're mourning logistical things. We lived with this person. I've had clients who had to move within a month of losing somebody because they weren't on the lease. I've had clients who became bankrupt and had to deal with that in the midst of intense mourning. If we're living with the person, we're losing the daily companionship. We're losing the person who maybe would have supported us most through something like this. So you brought up those multiple losses that are contained in every loss. You mentioned the spiral coming back to the loss, and that's very common. That as we go through different developmental periods, I think of it as coming up with a story or a meaning about what happened. And we develop a new story. As we change, as we learn, as we grow, as we become different people, we come up with a new story of what happened.
Can I say something about a new story for
Certainly.
me? Because, Kara, something you had said at the beginning is that there are certain kinds of thoughts that are different for people after someone they love has ended their life. And one of, not the only, but one of the feelings or thoughts I had after my mother died was that she had abandoned me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had some anger at her. I also had some of that guilt about, is there something I could have done? Could I have done something differently that could have changed this? And my mom is one of the, whatever percentage of people with bipolar disorder who do not respond to lithium. And there weren't really good medication alternatives back in the early 1980s. And so she never was effectively treated. She had a competent psychiatrist in the last couple of years, but she was never effectively treated. And so the new story that I've come to in more recent years is that my mother had a life-threatening illness, and there was not an effective treatment for it, and so she died of her illness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it took you time and different perspective, a shift in perspective to come to that.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
And you said time, right? It takes time, yes, to come to that.
And it's always evolving. You may have a different story or a slightly different story in 10 years. You mentioned that it's never something that's complete. Healing is always ongoing. Another thing you mentioned was in the first few months you didn't have any positive memories, and then positive memories started to come back. And that's fairly common. There's something, and it's not absolute, but there's something called a dual process model of grief. People tend to be looking backward more often in the beginning and looking forward more often. What does this mean? What is my new relationship? Something you mentioned with the person I've lost. And people oscillate between these two orientations of looking back and looking forward. Especially with suicide, there is more looking back about the death itself rather than the life at first. At first, there is a need to tell the story. I saw one woman, I think it was the day after her boyfriend took his life by suicide, and I sat with her for about 2 hours, and it was repetition over and over and over again. That's what she needed then because of the shock. So she was looking back at the death, then later she looked back at the life, and then later she spent more time looking forward. What does this mean to me, and what kind of place does he have in my heart? And then one more thing that I noticed when you were talking about that's fairly common is it's called post-traumatic growth. And you mentioned, you said you draw on the experiences now to make a contribution. And it's a booby prize, I'll call it. It's not something you would ever sign up for willingly, but it is one silver lining. Often people do find growth in this experience in the long term. It's not something that can be rushed. One way is in making meaning of their own life, what is important here. Another way is in giving and helping, having a desire to do that. And another way research shows is that life becomes more precious to people who have lost someone. So those are some elements of your story that I've heard with others. Yeah.
What, as you listened to her story, you did point out some areas where, because it was suicide, it sort of differed from grief. So when people experience a suicide and others around them try to maybe advise them or give them feedback based on other grief they've had, what sort of warnings would you give to them? Do you know what I mean? Like,
yes, I do.
Because this is different. The situation is different.
I'm laughing because you used the word advise, and if I had to say one thing that is most common with my clients is they do not like advice.
Oh, okay.
They don't like advice. And it's not universal either, because occasionally there's somebody who's so lost that they appreciate, at least temporarily, having their hand held and being told what to do. But generally that wears off pretty quickly. What people really want, if you ask them, is a listening ear, which Lori pointed out. They want to be able to tell their story. They want to be able to work it out loud. They want to be able to repeat themselves as many times as they need to. They want to be able to not feel like they're too much. Their grief is too much for other people. If their grief is too much for someone else to hear, then how would it feel to be embodied in that? And they want to talk when they want and not talk when they don't want. Sometimes well-meaning people will show up and say, okay, I'm here to listen, and the person's not in a place to talk. So in terms of supporting someone who's lost someone to suicide, I would say realize that there's often an element of trauma involved and shock. And I'm not using trauma in a clinical sense. There's a whole definition to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, but I'm using it in more of a bodily sense. Your body has a shock reaction, and it's very physical. So realize that there's often dysregulation at first. People aren't eating, they're not sleeping. They literally can't think. Their prefrontal cortex is offline. So they can't plan, they can't reason, they can't remember. So that's normal. Don't worry about it.
It'll come back.
It'll come back.
Yeah, people do worry that maybe this is the new normal for them.
Of course, especially if you've never seen that or experienced it before.
About advice that's helpful or not helpful, I don't remember a ton of advice per se. What I did get was some signals of, you should stop talking about this, or I feel uncomfortable with your talking about this, or you've been grieving long enough. So I got some of that. I mean, mostly if people felt that way, they just stayed away. I did get one piece of advice relatively early on that I really valued, and I still think of. I was sitting with a relatively new friend, and so she was one of the first people who didn't already know me that I was telling about my experience. And so I told her that my mother had committed suicide. I used that term then, I don't so much now. And when I told her, I looked away, and she said to me, "Don't do that. Don't look away. You look ashamed. Don't be ashamed. There's nothing for you to be ashamed of." And now I know it's probably not the most skillful thing to tell somebody not to feel something that they're feeling. I understand that.
The way she said
the
it.
way,
but, but you heard the message.
I heard the message, and it was very helpful for me to have somebody say to me in a way, you don't have to be ashamed.
Right.
And it made it easier then for me to tell the next person who didn't already know.
Mm-hmm. So the one piece of advice maybe people could give is however you feel is the right way to feel.
And you don't need to feel ashamed.
And you don't need to feel ashamed.
Yeah.
You brought up the question of a lot of times the shame is, wasn't I enough, or could I have stopped it? And I will give a definitive answer to that, no. Because in every case, if you could have stopped it, you would have. With what you knew at the time, you couldn't have stopped it, and you can't go back with the hindsight of what you know now and reevaluate because you didn't know that at the time. So that is a definitive answer. You could not have stopped it because you would have. If you could have.
If it's okay, I'd like to back up a little bit because Lori, you said at that time I used the term suicide and I don't anymore. Can you talk about what's behind that and what you're thinking?
Sure. So if you think about what the word suicide means, it means self-murder. And murder is a very, very charged word. And I think I really get that as a former criminal defense attorney. And the way I think about what was going on for my mother was really suffering. She was suffering. She had an illness. And so I don't like to use the term murder connected with how her life ended. And at the same time, I don't want to be euphemistic, so I wouldn't only say she died. I mean, I'm willing to say she ended her life because I feel like that is literally what happened. And she ended her life because, in my current story, and I agree with Kara that maybe it'll change in 10 years, but my mother ended her life because her suffering had become too much for her to bear, and she didn't see a pathway of relief.
Yeah, thank you. And could I talk a little bit about mental illness and suicide?
Yes, please do, Kara.
So about half of people who take their life are have a diagnosed mental illness at the time they take their life. And I've seen many clients like that. I've seen depression. I've seen schizophrenia. Both people who had advanced schizophrenia and people who were newly diagnosed and saw what their path may be, young people. And then bipolar disorder, some of the major reasons. Also intense anxiety sometimes. Maybe 60 to 90% of all people who take their own life have a mental illness that's not diagnosed. Research is very varied on that. I've seen everything from 56 to 90%. A lot of it depends on definition. So more people have a mental illness that's not diagnosed. And there are other people who take their life because of other reasons. One reason may be that their coping mechanisms are overwhelmed by stressors. Many things go wrong, or they don't have strong coping. Impulsivity, there was somebody I knew who lost a job, was unemployed for an extended period, got another job, was laid off from that, and coming home from work, he jumped in front of a train. And nobody who knew him thought there was any mental illness involved. So impulsivity is a big reason. Deaths are going up. More deaths by suicide. More taking own life by gun deaths, which is a very lethal method. Mm-hmm. So there are about 45,000 people a year who die by taking their own life. Women are 3 times as likely to attempt suicide, but men are 3 to 4 times as likely to succeed due to the fact that they tend to choose very lethal methods.
Yeah, I was struck by one statistic I saw that said a person dies by taking their own life or by suicide every 12.8 minutes.
Yes,
yeah.
That's true. We think of teens as taking their own lives, and actually, statistically, elderly males are the most likely to take their own lives.
Mm-hmm.
So another reason is illness, physical illness, and not wanting to go through what that entails. Caucasians and Native Americans are most likely to take their own lives, by far, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And then young people, young men and older men.
So it really gives us a feeling about why it's so important to talk about it. And I'm struck frequently where there's some absence of information. You read something and it's clearly indicating that there's something unusual about that death, but it's not spoken about. Mm-hmm. So I'm just so appreciative that we're here and we're talking about it.
And I'm called to give the number of suicide prevention line. Would you like that now?
Yeah,
or
please,
at the end?
go ahead.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a national number that will put people through to local support, and it's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's 800-273-TALK, TALK. There's also a crisis text line, and a lot of my younger clients like that. The number is 741-741, and you text the word HOME, HOME, and somebody will respond by text. For both of those, you don't have to be the person who is considering taking their own life. You can be someone who is concerned and ask questions.
Great,
So.
thank you for sharing that. I'm just going to take a moment to do a station break and let people know that you're listening to 90.7 KSQD, K-Squid, your ink spot on the dial. This show is State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well, and I'm your host, Deborah Sloss. Today we're here talking about surviving and recovering from grief following a suicide, and I'm joined by two guests, Kara Bowman and Rabbi Lori Klein. So we were just talking about the statistics and how prevalent this suicide or taking one's own life is. And Lori had been sharing about her own personal experience. So I was just thinking about there's probably a lot of people listening who have been affected by this in one way or another in their own lives. And I'm wondering, Lori, as you look back at your experience, what do you wish other people had known or understood, about what you were going through?
I wish people had known that there's no one-time scale for going through grief, and that grief does change over time, and that I wish people had known how long it would really take for me to soften my memories of my mother's death. There was one time when I was walking with a friend shortly before the anniversary of my mother's death, and I was telling him how tired I am of having these intrusive memories. It was before I had the experience where I was free of them. And so there's this, in Judaism, you read through the entire 5 books of Moses, the entire Torah, over the course of a year. And each week you read a different portion of the Torah. So you read a different Torah portion. And the idea is you try to get something different out of the Torah portion each year when you read it again. And he said to me, this is Rabbi Eli Cohen, who's also a local rabbi, he said to me very compassionately, this is your Torah portion.
Mm.
And I wish other people had known that once you have certain experiences, that's going to be your Torah portion for the rest of your life. And just to be willing to keep listening as people unravel the myriad meanings in their Torah portion.
It's beautiful.
It is really beautiful. It really reminds me of what you said earlier too, Kara, about someone's need to make sense of things, and that it sort of links to what I know about any kind of traumatic experience. That you strive to keep making some kind of narrative out of it that makes sense to you, and I would imagine as you grow through the lifespan, what makes sense keeps changing, right? Because you're growing and changing. So that really
And that's very true of any trauma, and losing someone by suicide is trauma on top of grief. Mm-hmm. So it's trying to do both at the same time, make sense of this trauma and grieve this loss at the same time.
Yeah.
Very, very difficult. The metaphor I like is a path. Everyone is on a path, and you're never going to get to the end. All you know is that by putting one foot in front of the other, you are getting somewhere. Kind of like you're peeling the onion. You'll never get to the bottom, but you are getting somewhere. And you can't see ahead of you on this path. You might climb a very hard mountain and come down, and there might be another mountain right ahead of you. Or you might go into a meadow and think that, oh, I've kind of done the hard part, and then go into a dark forest. You can't see what's coming. You can't see what's ahead of you. So what a friend can do is walk this path with you, maybe as a reporter or a private investigator, saying, what is this like? What is this like? What are you experiencing right now? With no preconceived notions, no notions of when it should end, and no notions of what it should look like, but figuring out with the griever, what does this look like?
What Carol, what you're saying, it makes me think about how sometimes things come up along the way that you're not prepared for in the moment, but you can then look back on. So just going all the way back to law school, probably, maybe between a year and 2 years after my mom died, that was a time in my life when I was not religious, I was not particularly spiritual, and it was nighttime, and my roommate Pam and I were studying in the living room, and her back was to me, and I was studying. I wasn't thinking about my mother, and all of a sudden I was overwhelmed with the scent of her perfume, and I felt her presence all around me, and I had no context for this experience, and I was terrified. And I didn't yell or say anything, but I think I made some kind of a weird squeak. And Pam turned around, and without saying a word, she raced over to the couch and sat down next to me and threw her arms around me very tightly. And as soon as she did that, the scent and my mother's presence completely vanished. And I had no rational explanation for that. I had no way of understanding it for years. And it really wasn't until I started studying to be a rabbi in my late 30s and early 40s that reflecting back on that experience drew me to read widely and think deeply about Jewish views of the afterlife and be able to put that experience into context. And also it then became an important way station on my path through life, continuing to have some kind of a relationship with my mother.
Wow.
Powerful.
It is really powerful. Yeah. And it makes, as you've told your story, it makes your story make sense too. That you were steered to make sense of that.
And that's a typical thing too, where people feel stuck in a stage of grief, and then something dramatic happens to shift it. With one woman, she was living her life, and one morning she woke up to make breakfast and found herself in a fetal position on the kitchen floor, sobbing literally all day. She couldn't get up. To her, it was out of the blue. To me, the way I conceive it is the grief stays there and waits very patiently until you're ready, and then makes itself known.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think when I was talking to you, Lori, leading up to doing the show, you had talked about readiness for different stages of grief, that you found that you could only grieve at the level you were ready at any given time. And I'm wondering if you want to say something about how that showed up in your life experience.
Yeah, so I had talked earlier about after that first semester of law school, which was really only 3 or 4 months after my mother died, putting away the expressive part of my grief. And the way I talked about it earlier was for more a utilitarian reason. I'm going to flunk if I don't do this. I do think also that I didn't kind of have the emotional support fully to grieve. I had tried to see a therapist, and I saw one of those kinds of therapists who just harumphs at you and doesn't really say much back, and got nothing out of that. And just in general, I think, didn't have enough emotional support to really stay in my emotions. And so even though my grief really came up when I was left by my girlfriend 8 years later, so even though I'm going through this other loss, I think the grief also came up because by then I was living in Santa Cruz. I was more independent as an adult. I had gone through the other process I needed to go through in my 20s, which was coming out as a lesbian. So I had done that work. And I just think I was stable enough then to go through the very painful part of that, really looking at everything and going through the guilt and the shame and the anger and all of the confusing emotions I had. And also to do the kind of reparenting I needed to do, because this was not only about my mother's death, it was also about living with a parent who struggled with mental illness and could be emotionally abusive. Mm-hmm. So I needed to have a lot of, I think, emotional stability to really work through that.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I just want to interject a little bit about the stages of grief, because when many people hear that, they think of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her stages of grief, and I think we're using that in a different way here today. You mentioned a lot of emotions, and there are all kinds of emotions, and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a brilliant woman in that she was the first person to speak with dying people about their experience rather than telling them what their experience should be. And what she found was a variety of emotions. She actually didn't write about grief. She didn't write about loss after death. She was writing about people who were dying. And she thought at that time there were 5 major emotions that happened in order. Later in her life, she realized that there were more than 5 emotions and that they didn't happen in a nice, neat order. So now we talk about stages of grief, not in terms of a sequential arrangement of emotions, but just in kind of a broad brush, where there will be the shock stage first, where your brain is trying to adjust to this new knowledge. It takes many, many repetitions to go down a neural pathway and create a new neural pathway and to erase an old one. So it's a process of discovering the person is gone. It's not a light switch that gets flipped. So that's kind of the first stage. And then the next very broad stage would be looking backward and mourning what you've lost, feeling the feelings involved in that. The next one would be making meaning, and that's what we've been talking about with the stories. And then the last one would be rediscovering what your relationship is to this person from here on out. Those are not in order. Those are jumping around. They're very, very broadly in order, but people jump all the time between those. And the piece about feeling the feelings, it doesn't have to be all the time. I sometimes get grievers who say, tell me what to do. I want to do this. I want to feel this. I want to go through this and get it over with fast. And unfortunately, grief is on its own time frame. So I talk about, if you want to know what to do or how to help a friend grieve, I talk about balancing 3 things. One is feeling the feelings. One is distraction, just anything that takes your mind someplace else. And one is self-care. What feeds you, what fills up your gas tank, what gives you more resource to go back and feel the hard feelings. So if you kind of think in terms of balancing those 3, most grievers will go, oh, I'm a little too much in here and not enough in here, and you can adjust and play with that. And that'll help you move down the path.
And be resourced for the
And
long journey that you're talking
Yes,
about. Yes.
yes.
Yeah.
Can I want to say something about what you were just saying about those balancing, feeling the feelings and distraction. So when I was in that intensive period of therapy in my early 30s, sometimes my therapist would give me homework, or I would give myself homework about feeling something or writing something about some of my feelings, and I would be scared about going into them that deeply. And so what I would do is I would say to myself, all right, what I'm creating is I'm creating a misery date. I'm going to have a misery date with myself, and I'm going to do whatever this is about feelings or journaling or whatever. But then before I sat myself down for my misery date, I would have already made another kind of date with a friend, so that I would have the security of knowing that I'm going to do this really hard thing, and then I'm going to go and be with somebody who I care about, and know that I could then have the distraction. And that made me braver both in therapy and with some of my therapy homework.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, I'm really glad you shared that too, that sort of wisdom about going into the feelings, but
And
also
back.
coming back out.
So I
of
give
those
people
two.
a technique a lot of people who are afraid that if they go into the feelings they'll be overwhelmed and they'll stay there. That's very, very common. Give people a technique of setting a timer, and it might just be 5 minutes, it might just be 2 minutes, and allowing themselves to go all the way there. And they have to stop when the timer goes off, even if they want to stay there, because otherwise they won't trust themselves next time.
Yeah.
So they have to stop when the timer goes off, no matter where they are. And that's been really useful for a lot of people, to allow themselves to go there. Other people, I've had visualizations. We go into, what are you afraid of, if you go all the way to these hard feelings, and then visualize some way out. One man came up with, he's on the edge of an abyss, and he's afraid he'll fall in and fall forever. And he visualized a big mattress at the bottom and a ladder back up. And then he could let himself go in, knowing he could bring himself back up. Other people need to be with someone when they go toward their feelings. Other people need to be alone, journal, or do a ritual, or be in nature.
I can tell as we're talking we could go on for a lot. There's so much to this subject, because like you said, I really thought that was astute, the way you said it's this complex mix of trauma and grief, and both kinds of techniques or wisdoms or approaches are important when you're addressing a loss due to suicide or someone taking their own life. And it also makes me think of something you said earlier, Lori, about maybe not today, but maybe when we were preparing, about trusting the wisdom in your own system, that at certain times you're not prepared to grieve, you're not in the right life situation, you don't have the resources, or you're just not mature enough. Remember you telling me about that. And at another time, at least grieving on certain levels, right? And then that's part of the reason it may come up in unexpected ways down the life span, right?
Yeah, probably what I was saying is something like what we sometimes think of as somebody being in denial is sometimes somebody, even unconsciously, exercising a certain kind of wisdom, that there's only so much knowledge or feeling they can tolerate in that moment.
And that might be different at a different point in their life.
Right.
Yeah.
Very true. But
Yeah.
and I would say, many people I've seen years and years after a death feel that not having the resources to go there and grieve has affected their life negatively. Trying to keep this in a container makes you go through all kinds of contortions. One woman came in, she had lost her partner to suicide when they were in their early 20s. They were newlyweds, and she came in her early 40s and said she never got close to anyone again and never had children because of this. So then she had that to mourn on top of her loss. So it does come out sideways if you keep it closed, but you do have to be in the right environment and have the right resources in order to to deal with it. I could
I'm really glad you bring that up, because I'd like to ask you if you have some resources you'd like to share with our listeners. People might be listening who either have lost someone to suicide or know someone. So,
sure.
What would you?
I would advise people to call Hospice of Santa Cruz County. They have an intake process in which they find out about you, your losses, your needs, and match you to the best services. So they offer groups, they offer individual counseling, and they also offer referrals. There's also Wings in Santa Cruz. It's run by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and it's a drop-in group for people who have lost a loved one to suicide. Their number is 459-9373. Did I not give the hospice number?
I'm not sure you gave the hospice number.
The hospice number is 430-3000. And then the last thing that I'd mention is there's a handbook for suicide survivors. Many people do not have the bandwidth to read a book in this state. So there's a handbook that's available free online that many people have found really useful. It's a little hard to find. You go to suicidology.org, which is a wonderful resource with a lot of information, but then search on handbook. And it's a 36-page handbook with all kinds of information for someone who has lost a loved one to suicide. There are also online forums that are specific to this kind of loss. Many people who don't process well with others or don't have people in their life to process with really find a lot of solace and support and help in the online forums, and you can find those just by Googling.
Thank you. Lori, do you have any resources? You mentioned the Anne
of Green Gables.
Anne of Green Gables books. Was there anything else that you would want to share with our listeners?
Sure. Kay Redfield Jameson wrote a book called An Unquiet Mind, which is about her own experience of having bipolar disorder. And this was something I read many years after my mother's death, and I felt like it gave me a little bit of insight into what it was like for my mother.
And she herself is a psychiatrist, I understand. So she has really both interesting perspectives of living with that and also sort of knowing all about what bipolar is and how it affects people. And
Right.
Yeah.
And then the other is a group that I didn't use myself, I think because they were not very widespread at the time of my mother's death, but I've had other people in my life who have benefited. It's called, the acronym is NAMI, N-A-M-I, and that stands for National Alliance on Mental Illness. The website for the national organization is NAMI, NAMI.org, and the local group is NAMISCC.org.
Great. And on those websites you can find lots of information, webinars, local support groups that are meeting, all kinds of things. I've actually done a show on NAMI here, so thank you for sharing that.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I can't thank you both enough for being here with me today and with our listeners and being willing to share such a personal and heartfelt story of your journey and healing. And I really think that it was, brave and generous of you to come and share that.
You're welcome, and thank you for inviting me to be on your show.
And thank you, Kara, too. You had a wealth of perspective and information, and to share with our listeners. I could tell that we could go on a lot longer, but unfortunately our time is running out for today.
Well, thank you for having this important conversation.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank both our guests for joining us and our listeners for tuning in to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss. I'll be back in 2 weeks, but tune back in next week, Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. My co-host, Mark DeGeer, is going to be hosting, and he'll be taking you on a narrative journey, exploring themes in how we think, feel, and behave. Mark's podcast will often bring in perspectives from popular culture and from contemporary scientific research. So join us again next week for State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. This is 90.7 FM, KSQD, K-Squid, your ink spot on the dial.